Alright, settle in. Before we get started on this whole wild ride through time, if you're finding this stuff even a little bit interesting, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. It really does help more than you think. And let me know down in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing this little community come together from all over the map. Now, find a comfy spot, maybe dim the lights a bit, and let's slip back through the centuries together. So, let's talk about the Middle Ages. More specifically, let's talk about one of the most repeated, confidently stated, and utterly misunderstood facts about them. You've heard it a million times, whispered in documentaries, dropped in casual conversation, written in half-baked online articles. The sentence goes like this: in the Middle Ages, people only lived to about 30. This idea has achieved folklore status. It's presented as this dramatic, tragic truth about a brutal, backward time. It paints a picture of a world where adults woke up on their 30th birthday, patted their loved ones on the head, and then just politely keeled over into the nearest ditch, their life's work complete. It's a great story. It's simple, it's shocking, and it makes us feel incredibly advanced and lucky by comparison. There's just one tiny problem. It's mostly nonsense. Not because the number is wrong, statistically speaking. On paper, it's sort of accurate. But because the way we understand that number is completely backwards. We hear life expectancy of 30, and we picture a death sentence, a biological limit, a countdown clock that ran out for everyone. But that's not what an average is. An average is a mathematical middle ground, and in the Middle Ages, that middle ground was a battlefield. A battlefield where the youngest soldiers died in staggering numbers before the fight even really began. Think of it like this. Imagine a village. In this village, 10 children are born in a year. Now, this is a rough time, medicine is guesswork, hygiene is an afterthought. Out of those 10 kids, let's say 5 don't make it to their 5th birthday. It's a tragedy, but it's the cold, hard reality. The other 5, though, they're tough. They survive the gauntlet of childhood diseases, the accidents, the lean winters. They grow up, they work, they marry, they have kids of their own. 2 of them live into their 50s. 2 make it to their 60s. And 1 stubborn old soul hangs on until 70, becoming the village's living encyclopedia and professional complaint department. Now, do the math. If you take the ages of all 10 at their time of death, the 5 infants, the 2 50-year-olds, the 2 60-year-olds, and the 1 70-year-old, and you find the average, what do you get? A number dragged down into the dirt by those early, devastating losses. You get an average life expectancy in the low 30s. But does that mean everyone dropped dead at 30? No. It means childhood was a lethal obstacle course, and surviving it was the real achievement. The famous, horrifyingly low life expectancy number doesn't tell us that medieval adults were fragile. It tells us the exact opposite. The adults walking around a medieval village, complaining about their bad backs and the lazy younger generation, were the survivors. They were the toughest of the tough. They had already run a brutal gauntlet that killed nearly half of their peers. By the time they were 25, they were veterans. That average isn't a countdown timer for adults. It's a report card on how insanely dangerous it was to be a kid. And that danger started the moment you decided to show up. Being born in the Middle Ages wasn't a gentle entry into the world. It was a high-stakes roll of the dice where the house had a massive advantage. Childbirth was a raw, terrifying ordeal for mother and baby, conducted in a world that had no idea what germs were, what anesthesia was, or why washing hands might be a good idea. There were no hospitals. Birth happened at home, in a room that was anything but sterile. The main expert in attendance was usually a midwife. Now, don't get me wrong, midwives were skilled. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, was often the best medicine available. They had herbal remedies that actually worked, techniques for positioning, and a deep well of experience. But they were operating in the dark. If something went wrong, if the baby was breech, if the mother hemorrhaged, if an infection set in, there were no emergency surgeries, no blood transfusions, no antibiotics. The tools were prayer, hope, and sometimes procedures so brutal they sound like something from a nightmare. The mother's life was on the line every single time. Pain relief? Maybe a swig of strong ale or some herbal concoction of dubious effect. Prevention of infection? Not a concept. Many women died from childbed fever, a rampant infection, days or even weeks after a seemingly successful birth, just when everyone thought the danger had passed. And this wasn't a risk they faced once. Women in this era had many pregnancies. High child mortality meant you had to have a lot of babies to ensure a few would survive to adulthood. So a woman might face this lethal gamble 5, 8, 10 times in her life. Each pregnancy was another conversation with fate, another brush with the statistical reaper. And the baby entered a world that seemed almost personally offended by its presence. The first breath was a gamble. Keeping warm was a challenge. Nutrition was tricky. If the mother couldn't nurse and there wasn't a wet nurse available, the options were grim. The first week of life was a critical danger zone. So many infants died so quickly that parents and communities often held off on formal baptism or even giving a name. It wasn't a lack of love. It was a heartbreaking form of emotional armor. Naming a tiny person, attaching your heart to them, only to lose them days later. That was a pain people learned to guard against. They hoped quietly, cautiously, without the luxury of certainty. So, you survived birth. Congratulations. You've officially cleared the tutorial level. Now the real game begins, and let me tell you, the difficulty setting was cranked to brutal. Medieval childhood wasn't a protected, innocent phase of life. It was the single most statistically dangerous period a human could experience, and it showed absolutely no mercy. Disease was the ever-present background noise of childhood. We're not just talking about the big history book plagues like the Black Death, though those were the apocalyptic versions. We're talking about the constant, grinding attrition of smaller illnesses. Measles, smallpox, dysentery, respiratory infections. A simple fever in a modern kid is a couple days on the couch with cartoons. In a medieval child, that same fever was a mystery that could spiral into a death sentence overnight, and no one knew why. There was no germ theory. Illness was thought to come from bad air, from imbalances in bodily fluids, from the wrath of God, from the alignment of the stars. Everything except the actual, invisible culprits. Doctors, if you could afford one, were guessing. Their toolkit was based on ancient Greek ideas about four humors in the body. Too much blood? They'd drain it. Too much black bile? They'd purge you. The treatments were often as dangerous as the diseases. A child weakened by fever might be subjected to bloodletting, which would, of course, weaken them further. Recovery often happened in spite of the medicine, not because of it. And it wasn't just disease. The world itself was a minefield of hazards. Kids worked early because everyone had to pull their weight. They helped in fields with large animals and sharp tools. They fetched water from deep, uncovered wells. They played near open hearths, rivers, and cart paths. There were no safety rails, no child-proof lids, no concept of supervision in the way we think of it. A fall, a cut, a burn. These weren't rare tragedies. They were common childhood events. And without antiseptics or proper wound care, a simple infected cut could lead to sepsis and death. Nutrition was another silent enemy. For the vast majority of people, the peasants' diet was monotonous and often lacking. It was heavy on bread and porridge, light on protein, fruits, and vegetables, especially in winter. In a good year, a kid might be lean but functional. In a bad year, a failed harvest meant hunger. A hungry child is a weak child, and a weak child has no defenses when the next illness rolls through. Malnutrition didn't kill directly very often. It just quietly eroded a body's resilience, making the next challenge that much harder to survive. Parents lived with this constant, low-grade dread. They loved their children fiercely. That's a myth we need to smash right now. The idea that they didn't care because loss was so common. They cared desperately, but they loved carefully, cautiously. Every milestone a child reached, surviving the first year, getting through a harsh winter, reaching an age where they could do real work, was a small, quiet victory, a sigh of relief. They didn't assume a happy ending. They hoped for it, one fragile day at a time. This emotional caution has been mistaken for coldness by later historians. It wasn't. It was a survival strategy for the heart. When loss is a frequent visitor, you don't stop loving. You just learn not to take tomorrow for granted. You pour your love into the present moment, because the future was never a promise. So, That infamous number, that life expectancy of 30, is really a story about the beginning of life, not the end. It's a testament to how brutal the opening chapters were. It tells us the Middle Ages weren't a world of short lives. They were a world where you had to fight like hell just to earn the chance at a long one. The survivors, the adults who made it, were the toughest of their generation. And their story, the story of what happened after they cleared that harrowing gauntlet of youth, is where things get really surprising. So you've made it. You survived the lethal lottery of birth. You clawed your way through the disease-ridden, accident-prone gauntlet of childhood. You are, by medieval standards, a certified badass, a veteran of the most dangerous campaign of your life, and you're not even 20 years old yet. This is where the story does a complete 180 from the popular myth. That infamous life expectancy of 30 statistic? For you, it's now essentially meaningless, because you've already beaten the odds that were dragging that average down into the dirt. If you reached adulthood in the Middle Ages, your personal life expectancy just got a whole lot better. Not safe, mind you. Let's not get crazy. This is still a world without antibiotics, with backbreaking labor, and where a bad tooth could kill you. But the constant, looming threat of death that shadowed your childhood has stepped back. It's no longer sprinting at you. It's walking calmly behind you, waiting for a moment of weakness. Think of the adults in a medieval village. They weren't all bright-eyed youngsters. Walk through the marketplace and you'd see plenty of folks with gray hair, bent backs, and faces carved deep with wrinkles from sun and wind. You'd see men in their 50s and 60s, griping about their aching joints just like people do today. You'd see women who had borne multiple children, managed households, outlived husbands, and were now the respected, and sometimes feared matriarchs of their families. Old age wasn't some mythical, unreachable state. It was a real, visible part of the community. It was just a club you had to survive a hell of an initiation to join. These elders were the living memory of the place. They remembered the great famine of 20 years past. They could tell you how to fix a plow a certain way, which fields flooded in a wet spring, the old stories and songs that were fading. Their knowledge was the community's hard drive. They were consulted, respected, and sometimes blamed for everything that went wrong, because who else are you going to blame when the weather turns? That's still how it works. So what did adult life actually look like for these survivors? It was anchored in rhythms that were punishingly physical and deeply repetitive. For the vast majority, the peasantry, life was defined by work. Not an 8-hour shift, but a sun-up to sundown marathon of labor that changed only with the seasons. Spring meant plowing and planting, back-straining work behind an ox, your feet churning in cold mud. Summer was weeding, tending, the constant fear of drought or storm. Autumn was the harvest, a frantic, all-hands-on-deck race against time and weather, followed by the thankless tasks of threshing and winnowing. Winter was about survival. Repairing tools, tending animals in cramped quarters, spinning wool, and hoping the food stores lasted until spring. There was no weekend, no retirement. You worked until your body gave out, and then you worked some more, doing whatever lighter tasks you could manage. This daily grind wasn't just tiring. It was corrosive. It wore bodies down slowly year after year. A twisted ankle from uneven ground never fully healed, leaving a permanent limp. The constant bending and lifting wrecked spines. Respiratory problems were rampant from laboring in all weather and from the smoke-filled air inside homes. A strong adult at 25 could be a frail, pain-racked one by 45, not from some mysterious aging curse, but from simple, accumulated wear and tear. Your body was a tool, and it was used hard with little maintenance. And yet, within this framework, people built lives. They fell in love, or at least entered into practical partnerships that became companionship. They raised the children who survived. They celebrated at weddings and wakes. They gossiped, argued with neighbors over fence lines, drank ale that was probably safer than the water, and found moments of music, storytelling, and crude humor. Their world was small, often no more than a day's walk from where they were born, but it was deeply known. Every tree, every stream, every patch of land had a name and a history. For women who reached adulthood, the calculus was different, and in many ways harder. A woman had navigated all the standard dangers of childhood, only to then face a recurring, specific threat that never took a vacation. Childbirth. As we talked about, each pregnancy was a roll of the dice. But here's the thing, reaching adulthood didn't mean you stopped rolling. Women typically had many pregnancies. It was a biological and economic necessity. So, a woman in her 20s and 30s was often either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from childbirth, all while managing the crushing daily labor of a peasant household. Cooking over an open fire, baking bread, brewing ale, making cheese, spinning, weaving, tending a vegetable garden, and caring for other children. Her body was under a constant dual assault, the physical strain of work and the profound physical trauma and risk of repeated childbirth. It's no wonder that surviving all of this into later life conferred a kind of legendary status. An older woman was a force of nature. She was a repository of practical knowledge about herbs, healing, childbirth, and managing a home. She often held significant, if informal, power within the family and the wider circle of village women. But let's be clear, reaching old age for anyone was no picnic. There was no pension, no social security, no assisted living. Your safety net was your family. If you had children who were alive, healthy, and willing to care for you, you could hope for a relatively secure, if diminished, old age, helping with lighter chores and minding the grandchildren. If you didn't have that family, or if they were too poor to support you, your prospects were bleak. You might end up as a beggar, dependent on the uneven charity of the parish or the monastery. The medieval world had a concept of charity, but it was unpredictable and rarely enough. This brings us to the great, quiet divider in medieval life, the thing that tilted the odds long before you took your first breath: social class. Who you were born to was the single biggest factor in your personal survival equation. If you were born a peasant, your life was a masterclass in exposure. You lived in a cramped, damp, smoky cottage with your family and possibly your animals. Your diet was monotonous and nutritionally shaky. Your work was brutally physical from a young age. You were on the front lines of every hardship. Famine hit you first, disease spread fastest in your crowded conditions, your body broke down soonest from labor. Your life expectancy was the one being weighed down by all those anchors. If you were born a noble, the picture was different. You lived in a stone castle or manor house, drafty and uncomfortable by our standards, but dry and defensible. You ate a more varied diet with regular meat. Your work might involve managing estates, practicing arms, or engaging in politics, but it rarely involved backbreaking physical labor in a field. You had servants to do the dangerous, dirty jobs. When illness struck, you had access to the best doctors money could buy, which, as we know, wasn't necessarily a good thing, but it felt like an advantage. Your children were more likely to survive infancy because wet nurses and better food were available. But, and this is a huge but, nobles weren't safe. Not by a long shot. Their world came with its own unique set of lethal hazards. Disease, the great equalizer, didn't care about your title. Plagues swept through castles as readily as through peasant hovels. The medical advances a noble could afford, like aggressive bloodletting, could be just as fatal. And then there was violence. Noble women still faced the dangers of childbirth. Noblemen were expected to fight. They died in wars, in tournaments, which were essentially sanctioned, often fatal brawls, in personal feuds, and in the treacherous political games of the royal court. A noble life might be longer on average than a peasant's, but it could also be spectacularly short. Then there was the clergy, the third major social group. Monks, nuns, and priests often had surprisingly good odds. A monastery or convent provided incredible stability for the time. Regular meals, a roof over your head, a community for support, and mandated periods of rest. The work was often intellectual or craft-based, copying manuscripts, brewing beer, tending herb gardens, rather than relentlessly physical. You were also somewhat insulated from the chaos of secular life. Wars, famines, and family strife. It's no accident that medieval records show members of religious orders often living longer, on average, than either peasants or nobles. They had, in essence, a medieval version of a healthcare and social security plan. So when we look past that misleading average, the medieval world comes into a sharper, more human focus. It wasn't a monochrome landscape of short, miserable lives. It was a sharply stratified landscape of unequal risk. Your journey, whether you died at 2, at 20 in childbirth, at 35 from an infected wound, or at 65 from sheer exhaustion, was profoundly shaped by the random luck of your birth, the resilience of your own body, and 1,000 tiny moments of chance. The people who populated this world weren't waiting around to die at 30. They were too busy trying to live. They were planting next year's crop, fixing a leaky roof, teaching a child a skill, praying for a sick friend, celebrating a good harvest, mourning a loss, and hoping, always carefully, quietly hoping, that they'd see another spring. They understood uncertainty in their bones. They didn't plan for retirement at 65. They planned for the next season, the next winter, the next harvest. Each year survived was a victory, not a step toward a predetermined end. Their stories weren't defined by a number, but by endurance. And that endurance, that stubborn will to keep going in a world that offered no guarantees, is something we can still recognize, even from across the centuries. It's profoundly, stubbornly human. Let's get real for a minute. We've talked about the big picture of survival, but the day-to-day reality of medieval life? It wasn't just about toughing it out. It was about navigating a world where invisible enemies and well-meaning but clueless allies could kill you just as dead as any sword or famine. So, let's pull back the curtain on the two biggest players in this daily drama. Disease, the silent, constant stalker, and medicine, its enthusiastic but dangerously incompetent partner. First up, disease. If the medieval world had a background soundtrack, it would be the sound of someone coughing. Not a polite little cough, but a deep, rattling, "Is this the end?" kind of cough. Illness wasn't an occasional visitor that showed up, caused a fuss, and left. It was a permanent resident. It lived in the walls, in the water, in the air, and in the crowded beds people shared. We have to ditch our modern mindset to get this. Today, we know about germs. We know to wash our hands, boil water, isolate the sick. Medieval people had none of that. Their understanding of why people got sick was a wild mix of religion, superstition, and ancient Greek philosophy that had gotten seriously twisted over the centuries. They thought illness came from bad air, called miasma, from an imbalance of the four humors inside the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, from the wrath of God, or from the malicious influence of the stars and planets. This meant their response to disease was often spectacularly unhelpful. Let's say you wake up with a fever, in your small, dark cottage, packed with your family. The air is thick with smoke from the fire and the smell of unwashed bodies and animals. You feel terrible. What happens next? Your family might try a folk remedy, a poultice of herbs, a special prayer, a charm worn around the neck. Some of these folk cures, born of pure observation, actually worked a little. Honey on a wound, willow bark tea for pain. But they were diamonds in a very large, very rough pile of nonsense. If you were rich enough, you'd call for a doctor. This was often a roll of the dice with worse odds. The medieval doctor was a confident man. He had to be. He was operating on theories that were fundamentally wrong, but he believed in them completely. His diagnosis would likely involve inspecting your urine. The color, smell, even the taste, yes, taste, were thought to reveal your internal imbalances. He might consult an astrology chart to see which planets were misaligned and affecting your humors. His treatment plan was almost guaranteed to involve one of two things: removing something from your body or trying to rebalance it in a dramatic way. The go-to procedure was bloodletting. The theory was simple: too much blood caused fever and inflammation. The solution: drain off the excess blood. A surgeon, or more commonly a barber surgeon, the guy who also cut your hair, would open a vein or use leeches. If you were weak from illness, losing blood was, of course, the worst possible thing. People regularly died from the cure, not the disease. Other treatments included purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea with powerful herbs, and sweating a fever out by piling on blankets near a fire, which could easily dehydrate and kill a patient. Surgery was a horror show. There was no effective anesthesia beyond alcohol, opium, or a knock on the head. There were no antiseptics. A surgeon's speed was his only real skill. The faster he could amputate a limb or remove a stone, the less time you had to die from shock or pain. Infection afterward was almost a given. And here's the cruel twist. Sometimes people did get better after these treatments. The human body is resilient. It can fight off minor infections on its own. So when a patient survived a fever after being bled, the doctor took full credit. Confirmed his belief in the system. The countless who died? Well, their humors were too far gone, or it was simply God's will. The system was unfalsifiable. It couldn't be proven wrong, because failure was always the patient's fault or part of a divine plan. This medical theater played out against a backdrop of constant low-grade infection. Life was dirty. Towns had no sewage systems. Waste was thrown into the street or into cesspits that leaked into the water supply. Butchers slaughtered animals in the open market, leaving offal in the gutters. Flies were everywhere. Clean water was a luxury. Most people drank small beer, a weak, fermented brew, because the brewing process killed some pathogens. It was safer than the local river, which was basically an open sewer. This environment was a paradise for what we now call waterborne diseases and fecal-oral pathogens. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, these weren't rare outbreaks. They were annual events, especially in the summer. They killed the weak, the very young, and the very old with brutal efficiency. Respiratory diseases, from simple colds that turned into pneumonia to tuberculosis, the consumption that slowly wasted people away, thrived in the smoky, poorly ventilated, crowded living spaces. Then there were the parasites. Intestinal worms were probably the norm, not the exception. They leached nutrients from already poor diets, causing anemia, weakness, and making people more susceptible to everything else. Lice, fleas, and ticks were universal companions, not just annoyances but carriers of diseases like typhus. What's truly remarkable is that people functioned at all within this simmering soup of pathogens. But they did. They developed a kind of grim tolerance. A stomach ache, a chronic cough, a festering sore. These were just part of being alive. You worked through it. You didn't have a choice. And yet, within this chaotic, dangerous system, there were pockets of real knowledge and effective care. They just often existed outside the official, male-dominated world of university-trained physicians. Midwives, as we mentioned, were often the most competent medical practitioners for women and children. Their knowledge was practical, hands-on, and based on generations of trial and error. The same was true of wise women or cunning folk in villages. These were often older women who knew which herbs could ease pain, which plants could help a wound heal, and how to set a simple bone. Their work was a blend of medicine, psychology, and community care. The church might call it witchcraft, but for the average peasant, she was the first and last line of defense. Monasteries also became unexpected centers of medical care. Monks grew extensive herb gardens for both cooking and healing. They ran infirmaries for the sick within their own communities and sometimes for the poor outside their walls. Their care was based on a mixture of classical texts, herbal lore, and Christian charity. It was often more gentle and nurturing than the aggressive interventions of secular doctors. They offered rest, clean-ish surroundings, and regular meals, three things that were themselves powerful medicine. So, when we imagine the medieval battle for health, we have to picture a confusing two-front war. On one front, you had the real, invisible enemy, bacteria, viruses, parasites. On the other, you had the allied forces, doctors with their dangerous theories, and folk healers with their mixed bag of useful and useless remedies, all trying to fight an enemy they couldn't see and didn't understand. Survival, then, wasn't just about being strong. It was about luck. It was about not catching the deadly strain of dysentery that swept through your village. It was about your body winning the fight against an infection before the doctor could bleed you into a coma. It was about having a wise grandmother who knew to put honey on a cut instead of dung. It was about belonging to a monastery during a famine. In a world without real science, staying alive was a combination of resilience, chance, and sometimes knowing who not to call for help. This constant, intimate dance with sickness shaped the medieval mind in deep ways. It fostered a profound acceptance of suffering as a normal part of life. It made people deeply religious, not out of abstract piety, but as a practical strategy for appealing to the only power that seemed to have any control over the chaos. Prayers for health weren't just spiritual. They were a vital part of the treatment plan. Saints associated with healing, like Saint Roch or Saint Anthony, were hugely popular. People went on pilgrimages to shrines not just for salvation, but for a very real hope of a cure. This world of constant microbial threat makes the achievements of those who lived long lives all the more extraordinary. The old man with the stoop and the raspy cough wasn't just old. He was a living monument to 1,000 battles won against invisible foes, a testament to a body that had, against all odds and all logic, simply refused to give up. Okay, let's shift gears entirely. We've been down in the mud and the grit of medieval survival, a world defined by chance and raw endurance. Now, let's travel further back, to a place where power wasn't just about surviving the elements, but about mastering symbols, and to a woman who became one of history's most brilliant players of that game. Forget the damp castles and smoky huts. Close your eyes and imagine the blinding sun of Egypt, the smell of incense and dust, the weight of centuries carved into golden stone. We're in the New Kingdom at the absolute peak of pharaonic power. And we're here to talk about a queen who wasn't just a footnote to a great king, but a political force in her own right, Nefertari, the great royal wife of Ramesses the Great. But to understand Nefertari's power, you have to forget everything you think you know about queens as arm candy. In ancient Egypt, the queen wasn't just the king's wife. She was a vital piece of cosmic machinery. The pharaoh was a god on earth, the living embodiment of Horus. His job was to maintain Ma'at, the universal order of truth, justice, and balance that kept chaos at bay. The queen's role was to be his feminine counterpart, the earthly embodiment of the goddesses who protected the king and the kingdom. Isis, the magical protector. Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, and motherhood. Nefertari didn't just fill this role. She expanded it. She rewrote the job description. And she started from a position of incredible advantage. We don't know a ton about her early life, but the clues tell us she was no ordinary noble girl. Her name itself is a billboard, Nefertari Meritmut. Nefertari means the most beautiful one. Again, think harmony and perfection, not just a pretty face. Meritmut means beloved of the goddess Mut, a mother goddess. So from the jump, she's tagged with divine favor and ideal queenship. But here's the kicker. She was educated. Deeply, seriously educated. In a world where literacy was a superpower, maybe 1 or 2% of the population could read and write. Even many high officials relied on scribes. Nefertari could read and write hieroglyphs fluently. Think about that. Hieroglyphs weren't just an alphabet. They were sacred symbols, the literal words of the gods. To command them was to have direct access to divine language and state authority. This wasn't a princess learning to sign her name. This was a strategic education. She was taught religion, statecraft, diplomacy, the complex symbolism of royalty. She was being groomed not just to be a wife, but to be a pillar of the regime. When she married Ramesses II, he was a young king, bursting with ambition. He wanted to be the greatest pharaoh since the pyramids, to stamp his name on eternity so big that no one could ever miss it. And he saw in Nefertari not just a beautiful bride, but a perfect partner for that project. This was a political match, sure, but it seems to have been something more. A genuine meeting of minds, a recognition of her capability. From the very beginning, Ramesses broke the mold for her. Egyptian art was all about hierarchy. Size mattered. The king was always the biggest figure in any scene. Gods might be the same size as the king, but everyone else was smaller. Wives were usually tiny figures clinging to the king's leg. Not Nefertari. In temples and monuments from the start of his reign, Ramesses had Nefertari depicted at the same scale as himself. This wasn't a cute romantic gesture. This was a political declaration, carved in stone for eternity. This queen is different. Her authority is part of my authority. She is essential. She appears alongside him making offerings to the gods, a role usually reserved for the pharaoh alone. She's shown interacting with deities directly, acting as an intermediary. In the temple at Abu Simbel, the colossal monument Ramesses carved into a mountain to terrify his southern neighbors, he built a separate, smaller but stunning temple right next to his own. And he dedicated it not to a god, but to a goddess, Hathor, and to Nefertari, who was shown with the attributes of Hathor. The message? The queen is not just royal. She is divine. Her presence sanctifies his power and protects the border. But Nefertari's genius wasn't confined to stone. Her most surprising power was diplomatic, and it played out in one of the most tense political theaters of the ancient world, the relationship with the Hittite Empire. For decades, Egypt and the Hittites had been at each other's throats, fighting for control of what is now Syria. Ramesses famously fought them to a stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh. After years of grinding conflict, both sides were exhausted. A peace treaty was hammered out, one of the first surviving international treaties in history. But a treaty on papyrus is one thing. Trust between two superpowers that have been trying to wipe each other off the map for a generation. That's another. This is where Nefertari stepped in. We know this because letters survived. Not dry state documents, but personal correspondence between Nefertari and the Hittite queen, Pujahipa. Pujahipa was a legendary figure in her own right, a queen who essentially co-ruled the Hittite Empire with her husband. She was tough, smart, and not to be messed with. Nefertari's letters to her are masterpieces of political savvy. She addresses Pujahipa as "my sister," the highest term of equality between rulers. The tone is warm, respectful, and incredibly intelligent. She talks about friendship, sends lavish gifts of gold, fine linen, and precious oils. This wasn't just girl talk. This was high-stakes relationship management. While the kings dealt with armies and borders, the queens were building the human connection that would make the peace stick. Nefertari, with her literacy and understanding of courtly nuance, was the perfect person for the job. She could read Pujahipa's letters herself, grasp the subtext, and craft responses that strengthened the bond. She was essentially Ramesses' secret weapon for peace, using diplomacy, charm, and symbolic gift-giving to do what soldiers couldn't: create lasting trust. Imagine the scene in the Egyptian court. Advisors are talking about fortifications and troop movements, and Ramesses can turn to Nefertari, who has just decoded the latest letter from the most powerful woman in Anatolia, and get a read on the real situation, the mood, the concerns, the opportunities. That's power. Quiet, indispensable power. Back home, her role was everywhere. She managed a vast royal household. She was the mother of princes and princesses who would carry the dynasty forward. She participated in the endless religious festivals that were the heartbeat of the state, performing rituals that affirmed the kingdom's divine favor. To the people of Egypt, she became a familiar, comforting presence, the motherly, divine counterpart to the majestic, sometimes distant god-king. In a society where visual symbols were a primary language, her image, serene and beautiful in temples across the land, constantly reinforced the message. All is well, Marat is upheld. The royal house is strong and blessed. Nefertari's story shows us a different kind of endurance. Not the gritty survival of a medieval peasant, but the sustained, brilliant performance of symbolic power. She endured at the pinnacle of one of history's most intense pressure cookers, a royal court, by being smarter, more capable, and more perceptive than the role required. She didn't just wear the crown. She used it to shape policy, secure peace, and cement a legacy that would, quite literally, be set in stone. She proved that, in the ancient world, authority wasn't just about who shouted the loudest or swung the biggest sword. Sometimes, it was about who wrote the best letter, who understood the sacred ritual, and who could stand beside a colossal king, not in his shadow, but in his light, as an equal partner in the eyes of the gods and the people. Nefertari's power in life was a brilliant performance of ritual and diplomacy. But in ancient Egypt, life was just the opening act. The real test, the ultimate measure of your success, was how you navigated the journey into eternity. Death wasn't an end. It was a transition to a second, everlasting existence. And the preparations for that journey were the most important project of your earthly life. For a queen like Nefertari, it was her final, and perhaps greatest masterpiece. When Nefertari died, the machinery of the state didn't just mourn. It mobilized to ensure her safe passage. She was laid to rest in the Valley of the Queens, a sacred burial ground near Thebes. Her tomb, known as QV66, isn't just a resting place. It's a stunning declaration. When it was rediscovered in 1904, archaeologists were floored. The paint was so vivid, so shockingly fresh after 3,000 years, it looked like the artists had just left the room. The walls of her tomb are a guidebook to the afterlife, a visual cheat sheet for the soul. But this isn't a generic guide. This is a personalized, first-class ticket. In most tombs, you see the deceased being judged, pleading their case before Osiris, the god of the dead. There's tension, fear of the weighing of the heart against the feather of truth. Not in Nefertari's tomb. Here, she is calm, assured, and in control. She is shown standing before Osiris not as a supplicant, but as an equal, a welcomed guest. The gods themselves reach out to her. She is led by the hand by Hathor, the goddess she was so closely associated with in life. Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of souls, protects her. In one breathtaking scene, she plays a board game called Senate, which symbolized the journey through the underworld. She is active, engaged, moving confidently through the realms of the dead. The texts painted beside her aren't the standard spells for commoners. They include excerpts from the Book of the Dead, but also from more exclusive, royal texts like the Book of Gates and the Litany of Ra, manuals for navigating the darkest, most dangerous hours of the night and uniting with the sun god himself. This was the spiritual equivalent of giving her the nuclear codes. It signaled that her soul was expected to travel in the most exalted circles of the afterlife, alongside the sun god and the king. Every detail screamed privilege and divine favor. The colors are lavish. Deep lapis lazuli blue, vibrant ochre, shining gold leaf. She is eternally young, beautiful, dressed in the sheerest white linen. Her tomb is smaller than a pharaoh's, but its artistry is arguably finer, more intimate, more focused on beauty and assurance than overwhelming scale. This tomb tells us one thing loud and clear. Nefertari was not just allowed into the afterlife. She was expected there. Her place was secured. The gods were waiting for her. In a culture where death was the final exam, Nefertari's tomb is the report card of a valedictorian. But here's where the story takes a strange, haunting turn. For all this perfection, for all this careful preparation for eternity, her body is gone. The magnificent burial chamber, the sarcophagus, the canopic jars that held her organs. They were all empty when found by modern archaeologists. Her mummy had vanished. This absence is a mystery that echoes. Was her tomb robbed in antiquity? Her body stripped of its gold and jewels and unceremoniously destroyed? Possibly. But the tomb itself, while looted, wasn't utterly vandalized like many others. The art is pristine. It feels more like a careful, respectful removal. Some scholars think her mummy might have been moved by priests in a later dynasty to protect it from tomb robbers, hidden in a secret cache somewhere, and then lost to time. Perhaps it lies in an unmarked pit with other royal mummies, her name erased by decay. It's a profound irony. The woman who mastered symbols, whose image was crafted for eternity, whose name was meant to be spoken forever to keep her soul alive, her physical self, the anchor of that soul, has disappeared. The most personal part of her is missing. And yet, in a way, this absence has only magnified her legend. Without a mummy to fix her in a museum case, Nefertari exists more powerfully as an idea. She is the face on the wall, the intelligence behind the letters, the divine presence in the temple. She has become eternal not through her preserved flesh, but through her story, her art, her undeniable impact. The empty tomb asks a question that her life answers. What matters more, the physical shell or the legacy you build? Nefertari's legacy is so strong it doesn't need her bones. Her rediscovery in the modern era didn't just add a chapter to Egyptology. It rewrote the book on Egyptian queens. Before Nefertari's tomb was found, people could dismiss powerful women in ancient history as exaggerations or myths. Here was incontrovertible proof, in paint and stone, of a queen who operated at the highest levels of religion, politics, and international diplomacy. She became the standard against which other royal women are measured. She forced historians to stop looking at queens as mere accessories to power, and to see them as potential centers of power themselves. Today, when you look at her painted eyes in that tomb, you're not looking at a relic. You're looking at a person, a woman of intellect, grace, and profound strategic skill. She used the tools of her time, literacy, ritual, symbolism, and personal relationships to carve out a space of immense authority. She wasn't a ruler in the traditional sense, but she shaped the reign of one of history's greatest rulers. She guarded his peace, sanctified his kingship, and helped project an image of divine perfection that strengthened an empire. Nefertari's story is a masterclass in a different kind of survival. Not survival of the body against disease and hunger, but survival of the name, the memory, the influence across millennia. She understood the rules of her world perfectly. That in Egypt, to be remembered was to live forever. And so, she made sure she was impossible to forget. She built her eternity not just in a tomb, but in the very fabric of her husband's legacy, in the peace with the Hittites, and in the awe that still strikes visitors who stand in her silent, beautiful, empty house of eternity. Let's make a hard left turn now, to a world as different from the sun-baked stone of Egypt as you can possibly imagine. We're going to the other end of the earth, to a place of wind, silence, and crushing cold. We're heading to the Siberian steppe, high in the Altai Mountains, where the sky feels vast enough to swallow time itself. This is a story that begins not with pyramids, but with permafrost. In 1993, on a remote plateau, a team of archaeologists was excavating a burial mound, a kurgan, frozen solid for over 2,400 years. They were expecting the usual. Some bones, maybe a few corroded bits of metal, fragments of a life long gone. What they found instead stopped their breath. The ice had not just preserved, it had suspended. In a sealed wooden chamber lay the body of a woman, so intact she seemed to be sleeping. Her skin was still there, marked with dark, intricate tattoos. Her hair, braided and adorned, was still attached to her scalp. The fine, felt and fur clothing she wore was not rotten, but perfectly recognizable. The ice had acted as a time capsule, refusing to let her go. They called her the Ice Maiden, or the Yukok Princess. And her discovery wasn't just an archaeological find. It was a confrontation. This wasn't a skeleton to be studied. This was a person, delivered across 25 centuries with a shocking immediacy. Her face, in repose, held an expression of serene authority. But it was her skin that told the most dramatic story. From her shoulders down her arms to her hands were elaborate tattoos. Not simple dots or lines, but elaborate, artistic designs. Fantastical deer with twisted antlers, mysterious cat-like predators, intricate curls and patterns. This was not decoration. This was biography written in ink and flesh. To understand her, you have to understand the world she came from, the Pazyryk culture. These were not city builders or empire keepers. They were nomadic pastoralists, masters of the horse, who roamed the vast Eurasian steppes. Their lives were defined by movement, by animal herds, by extreme cold, and by a deep, spiritual connection to a landscape that was both brutal and beautiful. They left no written records. Their history is told in the goods they traded, Chinese silk, Persian carpets found in their tombs, in their exquisite felt art, and in their bodies, preserved by the very cold they lived with. In this nomadic world, the lines we take for granted were blurred. The divide between human and animal, between the living and the spirit world, between men's and women's roles, was far more fluid. Archaeological evidence from across the steppe shows that women could be warriors, buried with bows and arrows. They could be leaders, buried with symbols of authority. And, crucially, they could be spiritual guides. The Ice Maiden's burial suggests she was the latter, a person of immense ritual importance. Her isolation on that high plateau was deliberate. She wasn't buried in a common graveyard. Her tomb was a log chamber, sealed and then allowed to flood with water that froze, creating a natural deep freeze. This wasn't a haphazard act. It was a technological choice, using the environment to preserve her forever. It meant her community believed her body needed to be preserved, that it held a power or a presence that shouldn't decay. Let's look at the evidence they left with her. There was no cache of gold or weapons to signal a warrior's status. Instead, there were 6 horses, saddled and bridled, sacrificed to accompany her. An immense display of wealth in a horse-based culture. She had a meal of sheep and horse meat for her journey. She had a small container of coriander, likely for its scent or ritual use, and she had a hand mirror of polished metal. Not a vanity item, but a tool often associated with shamans, used for divination or as a symbolic portal to other worlds. Then the tattoos. In steppe cultures, tattoos weren't mere fashion. They were a map of identity, belief, and spiritual attainment. The animals on her skin weren't chosen at random. The deer with its antlers reaching like trees likely symbolized the connection between earth and sky, a common shamanic motif. The predators spoke of power, protection, or spirit guides. The very act of tattooing was a painful, dangerous ordeal of puncture and soot ink, a trial of endurance. These marks declared her a person who had undergone transformations, who carried other worlds on her shoulders. Her clothing confirms this special status. She wore a long, intricate skirt of felt, wool, and horsehair, and a tall, elaborate headdress crowned with wooden carvings of birds and gold foil. This wasn't everyday riding gear. This was ceremonial costume, meant for rituals that connected her community to the forces of nature, to the ancestors, to the animal spirits they depended on for survival. So who was she? The evidence points strongly to a shaman or a folk healer, a QAM, in the Turkic traditions of the region. In these nomadic societies, the shaman wasn't just a priest. They were the doctor, the psychologist, the mediator between the human and spirit worlds. They diagnosed illness, which was thought to be caused by spirit loss or intrusion, performed rituals for hunting success, and guided the souls of the dead. Their authority came from knowledge, from endured suffering. The Ice Maiden's body shows signs of chronic pain, possibly from cancer or a riding injury, and from the community's belief in their abilities. Her death, around the age of 25, was likely from breast cancer, evidence suggests. In a world without our medical understanding, her illness might have been seen not as a weakening, but as a sign of her intense, perhaps overwhelming, connection to the spirit world, a world that could both empower and consume. The care taken in her burial speaks of deep reverence, but also, perhaps, of a kind of cautious fear. Burying her so meticulously, yet so separately, could have been a way to honor her power while also laying it to rest, ensuring her potent spirit was properly guided away from the living and into the next world. The Ice Maiden's story shatters 2 big, lazy myths. First, the myth of the primitive nomad. Her tattoos are high art. Her clothing is sophisticated textile work. Her burial shows complex understanding of their environment, using ice as a preservative and cosmology, the horses for travel, the food for the journey. This was a refined, complex culture. Second, and more importantly, she shatters the myth that ancient power was always male, loud, and violent. Here was a young woman whose authority was quiet, spiritual, and essential. She led not with a sword, but with knowledge of herbs, rituals, and the unseen. She was buried not with an army, but with the tools of her sacred trade. In a world of constant movement and mortal danger, she offered stability, healing, and a connection to something larger that made her, in many ways, more powerful than any chieftain. When the archaeologists lifted her from her icy tomb, they did more than discover a body. They unleashed a ghost, a presence that immediately began to challenge modern assumptions. Her discovery forced an uncomfortable question: who owns the past? To scientists, she was an unprecedented source of data. To the local Altai people, she was an ancestor, a QAM, whose disturbance they believed brought bad luck and angered the mountain spirits. Her removal to a museum laboratory in the city of Novosibirsk sparked protests and a deep sense of violation. The Ice Maiden, in death as in life, became a mediator between worlds, this time, between modern science and ancient belief, between curiosity and respect. She is a bridge to a way of life that valued different things: endurance over empire, spiritual connection over monument building, and the quiet, profound authority of a woman who could speak to the spirits on behalf of her people. We've traveled from the royal courts of Egypt to the frozen graves of Siberia, following stories of survival and power in the ancient world. Now, let's step into a different kind of arena, the battlefield of the mind. Because for all the swords, plagues, and harsh winters, one of the most enduring survival tools humans ever forged wasn't made of steel or stone. It was made of ideas, and it was born from a shipwreck. Picture this. Around 300 BC, a merchant named Zeno is sailing the Mediterranean. His ship is loaded with expensive purple dye, his fortune. Then a storm. The ship goes down. Zeno washes up on the shore of Athens, Greece. He's alive, but he's lost everything. His cargo, his money, his entire livelihood. He's a broke, soaking wet refugee in a strange city. Most people in that situation would be having a full-on meltdown. Despair, panic, maybe just giving up. But Zeno did something else. He looked at his situation and asked a revolutionary question. If everything external can be wiped out in an instant, what can a person actually rely on? He wandered into a bookstore, started reading philosophy, and began to shape an answer. His answer became Stoicism, and he didn't teach it in a fancy academy. He taught it under the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a public colonnade in the middle of the Athenian marketplace. This is crucial. His philosophy wasn't for scholars in quiet rooms. It was for people in the noise and chaos of real life. Merchants, soldiers, politicians, slaves. People who couldn't afford to collapse when things went wrong. So what did he teach? At its heart, Stoicism is about one brutal, liberating distinction. The split between what is in our control and what is not. Here's what is not in your control according to the Stoics. Pretty much everything. Your body's health, your reputation, your wealth, the weather, other people's opinions and actions, whether you get sick, whether you succeed or fail in a venture, whether you live or die. All of it is external, subject to fate, luck, and other people's choices. Trying to control this stuff is like trying to control the wind. It's a recipe for frustration, anxiety, and misery. Here's what is in your control: your judgments, your opinions, your desires and aversions, your character, your intentions, how you choose to respond to what happens. The Stoic argument is that suffering doesn't come from events themselves, but from the meaning we assign to those events. The shipwreck isn't the problem. The problem is Zeno's belief that I am ruined because I lost my fortune. Stoicism trains you to change that belief, to see the event plainly. The ship sank. My possessions are gone. Full stop. No added drama. The loss of stuff is outside your control. Your judgment about it, this is a catastrophe, is inside your control. You can choose a different judgment. This is an opportunity to start anew, to test my character. This is the core of mental clarity. It's about seeing the world as it is, not as you wish it to be, and then choosing a response based on virtue, on wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline, rather than on raw, unthinking emotion. Now, this doesn't mean Stoics were emotionless robots. They felt fear, grief, anger. The goal wasn't to never feel, but to never be enslaved by feeling. The difference is in the pause. Between something happening and you reacting, the Stoic practices inserting a moment of space. In that space, you ask, is this within my control? What would a wise, courageous person do here? To build this mental muscle, Stoics didn't just theorize. They practiced, relentlessly. This was a philosophy of action, negative visualization. They'd mentally rehearse losing what they cherished, their health, their family, their status. Not to be morbid, but to weaken the fear of loss. By imagining it beforehand, they reduced its power to shock. If you've already accepted in your mind that your child could die, you're not destroyed if illness strikes. You're prepared to face it with courage and care. The evening review. At the end of each day, they'd examine their actions. Where did I let anger take over? Where was I cowardly? Where did I act with integrity? Not to beat themselves up, but to calibrate. Like an archer checking their aim after each shot. Voluntary discomfort. They'd intentionally choose hardship. Sleeping on the floor, eating plain food, wearing rough clothes in cold weather. Why? To prove to themselves that comfort was a preference, not a necessity. To build resilience so that if real poverty or hardship hit, they wouldn't break. It was training for life's inevitable storms. This philosophy, born in a Greek marketplace, found its perfect home in the most unlikely of places, the heart of the Roman Empire. Rome was all about power, ambition, and brutal real-world consequences. And Stoicism became the operating system for some of its most powerful and most burdened figures. Take Seneca. He was a mega-wealthy advisor to the insane Emperor Nero. He lived in a palace, but he was constantly one wrong word away from being forced to kill himself, which eventually happened. His letters are obsessed with time, anxiety, and how to stay sane when you're rich, powerful, and surrounded by predators. Stoicism was his psychological armor. Or Epictetus. He was born a slave, his leg deliberately broken by a cruel master. He taught that freedom has nothing to do with your legal status. A man in chains who controls his own judgments is free. An emperor who is a slave to his rage and paranoia is the real prisoner. His teachings flipped the Roman idea of power on its head. Then there's the ultimate example, Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome. He spent years on the front lines of wars, dealing with plague, betrayal, and the immense weight of ruling the known world. His personal journal, never meant for publication, is called Meditations. It's essentially a series of stern notes to self, a Stoic cheat sheet for not losing his mind. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. He writes, he didn't complain that this was unfair. He accepted it as the nature of people and prepared his response. He used Stoicism to stay humble, just, and focused amidst absolute power. This is the raw, practical power of Stoicism. It's not about achieving some Zen-like state of bliss. It's about achieving steadiness. It's the mental equivalent of a deep foundation that keeps a building upright in an earthquake. The world outside, the earthquake of events, will still shake. But you don't have to collapse. Stoicism offered a radical kind of freedom, the freedom of inner sovereignty. It said that no matter what happens to you, slavery, exile, poverty, the death of loved ones, the loss of a kingdom, you retain one sacred, unassailable territory, your mind. And how you govern that territory determines the quality of your life, not the events that batter its walls. Zeno's shipwreck didn't ruin him, created him. It forced the question that birthed a system for surviving not just storms at sea, but the storms within. And that system, this philosophy of the unbreakable mind, would prove to be one of history's most durable survival tools, echoing from the painted porch to the imperial tent on a war-torn frontier, and all the way down to us. We've followed threads of survival across deserts, steppes, and the landscapes of the mind. But what happens when the individual story ends? How does a life, a philosophy, a name, fight the ultimate enemy? Being forgotten. This final act isn't about the struggle to breathe, but the struggle to mean something, to echo beyond the grave. It's about legacy, the long game that every person, from peasant to pharaoh, consciously or not, is forced to play. Let's start with our most ancient subjects. Nefertari built her eternity with chisel and paint. She understood the Egyptian rule. To have your name spoken, your image seen, was to live. She fused her identity with goddesses, with the king, with the very stones of temples meant to last for ages. And yet, her mummy vanished. Her physical anchor is gone. In a way, this final loss of her body completed her transformation. She is no longer a corpse in a museum. She is the beautiful face in the tomb, the diplomatic partner, the divine consort. She became pure idea, and ideas are harder to kill than bones. Her legacy survived the collapse of her empire, centuries of sand and silence, because she embedded it in art so stunning it demanded rediscovery. When her tomb was found, she wasn't just excavated. She was resurrected as proof that ancient women could wield profound, sophisticated power. The Ice Maiden's legacy is more complex, more haunting. Her people, the Pazyryk, left no written history. Their legacy was oral, carried in stories and traditions that faded with the winds of the steppe. For over 2 millennia, her legacy was the mountain itself, the silent, frozen pact between her community and the spirits. Then science intervened. Her discovery was a miracle of preservation, but also a violent translation. She was taken from her eternal ice and placed under fluorescent lights in a distant city. Her legacy split in two. For the global audience, she became a window. She single-handedly demolished the barbaric nomad cliché, revealing a culture of astonishing artistry and spiritual depth. She proved that power could be female, silent, and sacred. Her tattoos became an icon. For the local Altai people, however, her legacy became one of rupture and grievance. They saw her not as a specimen, but as an ancestor whose sleep was disturbed, bringing imbalance. Her story now forces a critical, modern question about legacy. Who has the right to own and interpret the past? Her enduring impact is not just historical, but ethical, a constant reminder that the dead have stakeholders. And then there's Stoicism. Here's a legacy that refused to die with its founders. When Rome fell, when temples to Zeus were abandoned, Stoicism didn't vanish. It performed the ultimate survival trick. It shed its skin and slipped into a new host. Early Christian monks in the Egyptian desert and Syrian cliffs faced a problem the Stoics knew well: how to master the chaos of one's own thoughts. In solitude, their minds became battle groups of temptation, despair, and pride. They found guidance in Stoic techniques, even if they didn't call them that. The Stoic practice of monitoring thoughts, of withholding assent from destructive impulses, became the monastic practice of watching over the heart. The Stoic ideal of apatheia, freedom from destructive passions, transformed into the Christian ideal of detachment from sinful desires. Stoicism's rigorous inner discipline provided the psychological framework for a life devoted to God. The philosophy's name was forgotten, but its bones were buried in the foundation of Western spirituality. Centuries later, those bones stirred again. In the trenches of World War I, in the concentration camps of World War II, people facing unimaginable horror rediscovered Stoic truths out of sheer necessity. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote Man's Search for Meaning, describing how the one freedom his captors could not take was the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. This is pure, undiluted Stoicism, forged in the 20th century's worst fire. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, the dominant modern therapy for anxiety and depression, is essentially clinical Stoicism. It teaches that our thoughts, not events, cause our feelings, and that by changing our thoughts, our judgments, we can change our emotional reality. A therapist's office in New York or London is, in a direct line, a descendant of Zeno's painted porch. Today, Stoicism's legacy is booming in the unlikeliest of places: boardrooms, locker rooms, and online forums. Executives read Marcus Aurelius for leadership lessons. Athletes use negative visualization to prepare for defeat. People drowning in digital noise and outrage find calm in the Stoic focus on what they can control: their own attention and action. It's been stripped of its ancient physics and theology, reduced to a mental operating system for resilience. Some complain this is a shallow, self-help version. And maybe it is. But the fact it still works, that its core mechanic, control your judgment, accept what you cannot change, still brings peace to 21st century humans, is a testament to how deeply it taps into a fundamental human need: the need for an inner citadel that cannot be stormed. So what do these three legacies tell us about survival in the long game? Nefertari shows us that legacy can be built deliberately, artistically, by tying your story to symbols of permanence like gods and stone. It's an active project of self-mythology. The Ice Maiden shows us that legacy can be imposed by chance, by earth, by the curiosity of later ages. It can also be contested, a wound as much as a gift, reminding us that the past is not dead until everyone who feels a connection to it is also gone. Stoicism shows us that legacy can evolve. It can shed its body and live on as a ghost in the machine of culture, finding new hosts in religion, psychology, and pop philosophy. Its survival proves that some ideas are so useful for the human condition that they become almost viral, adapting to survive any era. In the end, the fight for a legacy is the final, quiet rebellion against oblivion. The medieval peasant, with no tomb or treatise, still fought for it. Their legacy was the child who lived, the field that continued to be farmed, the story told by a fireside that maybe, just maybe, got passed down one more generation. It was a legacy of continuity, of adding one more link to a chain they would never see the end of. We are all building our legacies, whether we think about it or not. With every action, every word, every choice of what to care about and what to let go, we are chiseling at our own monument or planting a seed in frozen ground. The methods change: stone, ice, parchment, digital code, but the desperate, beautiful human impulse remains the same. To whisper into the future, "I was here. This is what I learned. Do not forget." From the pharaoh's wife securing peace with her words to the shaman whose frozen body challenges modern ethics. From the philosopher teaching resilience in a marketplace to the anonymous millions whose endurance built the world we stand on. The long game is all there is. And in that game, survival isn't just about lasting. It's about what lasts of you, and what it means to those who find your bones, your words, or simply the echo of your stubborn human will. So we've talked about Stoicism as a philosophy, this beautiful, logical system for mental clarity. But let's get our hands dirty. How did this thing actually work when the wheels fell off? Not in theory, but in the mud, blood, and screaming chaos of real life. Because that's where it was designed to operate. The porch was just the classroom. The world was the exam. Take the example of a Roman soldier stationed on Hadrian's Wall, at the freezing, foggy edge of the empire. He's from sunny Italy, and he's staring into the misty forests of Caledonia, where tribesmen who want his head are hiding. He's cold, bored, terrified, and years from home. What does Stoicism do for him? It doesn't warm his feet. It doesn't make the locals friendly. What it does is reframe his reality. The cold? Not in his control. The enemy's intentions? Not in his control. His commander's decisions? Mostly not in his control. His control lies in his post, in maintaining his gear, in the precision of his watch, in the courage he shows his fellow soldiers, in the letter he writes home with dignity, not self-pity. Stoicism channels his energy away from whining about the unchangeable fog and into mastering the changeable sphere of his own duty and demeanor. It turns a potential victim of circumstance into a voluntary guardian of order. His fortitude becomes a personal victory, regardless of whether he ever sees combat. Or consider a medieval craftswoman, a weaver in a guild town. The market is fickle. A rival's work is favored. The price of wool soars. Plague shuts the city gates. The temptation is to despair, to blame, to give in to the anxiety that gnaws at her livelihood. A Stoic mindset, absorbed perhaps from the town's priest who'd read the church fathers, would guide her differently. She'd separate. The market conditions are external. The quality of her weave, her discipline at the loom, her honesty in trade, these are internal. She focuses on perfecting her craft, the one thing she truly commands. If she fails despite her excellence, she can face it without her self-worth crumbling, because her worth was never in the sale, but in the skill and integrity she brought to it. This isn't passive resignation, it's active focus. It's pouring your effort into the clay you can shape, not shouting at the kiln fire for being too hot. This is the silent citadel Stoicism builds. External events lay siege to it. Illness, loss, betrayal, failure. They bang on the gates, they hurl fire over the walls. But inside the citadel, in the courtyard of your mind, you have a well of water, your reason, a forge, your will, and a garden, your character. The siege may last for days or decades. You may not be able to sally out and defeat it, but you can refuse to surrender the inner keep. You can choose what the siege means. Is it a tragedy, or is it the very condition for which you've been training? The Stoic hero isn't the one who wins every battle. He's the one who, like Socrates, drinks the hemlock without his hand shaking, because his integrity is more important than his life. She's the one who, like the fictional Stoic hero from later ages, can lose everything and still say, "I myself am neither wounded nor a prisoner. Fortune has taken only what she gave." The victory is in the stance, not the outcome. This explains Stoicism's dark, unsentimental side, prepares you for loss by expecting it, It's a philosophy for adults in a world that doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't promise you'll get the girl, save the kingdom, or die rich. It promises that you can face not getting her, seeing the kingdom fall, and dying penniless, without becoming a monster or a broken shell. Your dignity is the final, non-negotiable frontier, and that's why it echoes now in our world of fragile metrics like stock prices, viral fame. Our modern anxieties are different packaging on the same old threats. Uncertainty, rejection, the fear of obscurity. The Stoic asks, is your follower count in your control? No. Is the quality of your work, your honesty, your effort in your control? Yes. Then invest there. The rest is weather. The silent citadel isn't a lonely place. A surprising Stoic principle is that we are social creatures for a reason. Our virtue is meant to be exercised in community, with justice, with kindness, with duty. The calm mind isn't for retreat. It's for clearer, more effective action in the world. A leader not ruled by panic can make better decisions for his people. A parent not ruled by fear can offer truer security. The inner fortress isn't a hiding place. It's a command center that remains operational when all outside communications are down. So when we look at the grind of medieval life, the political snakes in an Egyptian court, or the spiritual trials on a frozen steppe, we can see a common thread. The individuals who left a mark weren't necessarily the luckiest or strongest in body. They were often the ones who best managed their minds. They built, whether in stone or in habit, a silent citadel, and from its walls, they looked out at a chaotic, dangerous, beautiful world, not with blind optimism or crippling fear, but with clear eyes and a will made steady by practice. They understood the oldest survival skill of all. Before you can change the world, you must learn to govern the kingdom within. We've spent a lot of time inside the medieval world, dissecting its dangers and its resilience. But a world doesn't just end, it transforms. The people of the Middle Ages, those battle-tested survivors, weren't just waiting for the Renaissance to show up and flip on the lights. They were laying the groundwork, often without knowing it, for the world that would come after. They were solving problems inch by painful inch, and their solutions, some brilliant, some brutal, became the inheritance of the modern age. Think of it like this: the fall of Rome wasn't a clean break. It was a collapse, a fragmentation into a million local pieces. The project of the early and high Middle Ages was, fundamentally, a salvage operation. How do you keep knowledge alive when empires crumble? How do you feed people when trade networks snap? How do you maintain any order when the biggest guy with a sword makes the rules? The answers they cobbled together became the structures we later dismantled, but also the foundations we built upon. Let's start with the most obvious: the church. When Roman bureaucracy vanished, the church's hierarchy, pope, bishops, parishes, remained. It became the only pan-European institution. It preserved literacy, however narrowly, in its monasteries. It provided a universal calendar, a common language, Latin for the elites, and a shared story that gave meaning to suffering and chaos. The church was often corrupt, political, and oppressive, but it was also a skeletal system that kept the body of Europe from dissolving entirely. It was a network, and networks are where ideas eventually travel again. Then there's the messy, violent birth of nations. All those feudal contracts between lord and vassal, all those oaths of loyalty, were initially just local survival pacts. You protect me, I feed you. But over centuries, these webs of obligation consolidated. Small lordships were absorbed by bigger ones. Through war, marriage, and sheer stubbornness, kingdoms like France and England began to coalesce. The medieval king wasn't an all-powerful dictator. He was often the top guy in a complicated pyramid of deals. This grinding, conflict-ridden process was building the very idea of centralized sovereign states, the containers for the modern world. Technology is another sneaky inheritance. We think of the Middle Ages as technologically stagnant. That's a myth born of comparison. They weren't building space rockets, but they were solving immediate, grinding problems. The heavy plow turned the dense, wet soils of northern Europe into farmland, triggering a population boom. The horse collar allowed horses to pull heavier loads than oxen, revolutionizing transport and agriculture. Windmills and watermills automated the grinding of grain and the fulling of cloth, freeing up labor and creating early mechanical power. These weren't just gadgets. They were force multipliers. They meant one family could farm more land, feed more people, produce more cloth. This slow accumulation of efficiency created surplus. And surplus is what allows for anything beyond mere survival. Trade, specialization, art, scholarship. The medieval craft guilds, with their rigorous apprenticeships, preserved and advanced technical knowledge in masonry, glasswork, metalwork, skills the Renaissance would later flaunt. Perhaps the most profound inheritance is harder to see. The mindset. The medieval person lived with contingency. They knew plans failed, harvests collapsed, lords died, plagues arrived. This bred a psychological flexibility, a capacity to endure paradox. Faith and superstition lived side by side. Brutal violence and exquisite piety could exist in the same person. This isn't schizophrenia, it's adaptability. The modern world, for all its science, still runs on this software. We make 5-year plans knowing a virus or a market crash can wipe them out. We live with the paradox of incredible comfort and existential dread. The medieval capacity to hope fiercely while expecting disappointment is a skill we never unlearned. Even the failures were instructive. The famines taught about grain storage and crop rotation. The plagues, horrifically, led to the first quarantines and public health ordinances, like isolating ships for 40 days. Quarantagiorni in Italian, hence quarantine. The Black Death, by wiping out a third of Europe, ironically broke the feudal system's back by making labor scarce and empowering serfs to demand better terms. Catastrophe forced change. The people living through it weren't thinking, "We are building the future." They were thinking, "We need to get through this winter." But with each winter survived, each field planted with a better tool, each manuscript painstakingly copied by candlelight, they were passing a baton. They were keeping the flame of law, of learning, of technique, of collective identity, alive in a very long, very dark night. When the so-called Renaissance arrived, it didn't come from nowhere. It sprang from the surplus created by medieval mills and plows. It was funded by the trade routes medieval merchants had risked their lives to reopen. Its scholars read classical texts preserved by medieval monks. It was built by the sons of medieval masons who had perfected the Gothic arch. We like clean narratives, Dark Ages, then Enlightenment. But history is a relay race, not a series of sprints. The Middle Ages were the gritty, muddy, often terrible middle lap where the runners were just trying not to drop the baton. And they didn't. They held on through plague and sword and hunger, and they handed it off, battered but intact, to the generations that would call themselves new. They were the necessary bridge between the ancient and the modern, the inheritors of collapse who became, slowly, stubbornly, the founders of what was to come. Their greatest legacy wasn't in their cathedrals or their charters, but in the simple, monumental fact of continuity. They endured, and because they endured, the story kept going. We've seen disease as the medieval world's constant, invisible foe. But the human response to that foe has its own story, a slow, clumsy, often tragic stumble from magical thinking toward something resembling science. This is the story of the body becoming a battleground, not just for pathogens, but for competing ideas about what a body even was. For over 1,000 years, Western medicine was held hostage by a beautiful, logical, and completely wrong idea: the theory of the four humors. Dreamed up by the ancient Greeks like Hippocrates and Galen, it saw the body as a microcosm of the universe, made of 4 fundamental substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health was their perfect balance. Sickness was an imbalance. It was an elegant system. It explained personality types: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, melancholic. It linked the body to the seasons and the elements. It was philosophically satisfying, and it justified doing horrible things to sick people. If a patient had a fever, too much hot, wet blood, the cure was to remove blood. If they were lethargic, too much cold, wet phlegm, you'd induce vomiting or sweating to dry them out. The logic was internally consistent, which made it dangerously persuasive. A doctor who bled a patient to death could record that the patient's humors were too far corrupted to be saved. The theory could never be wrong. Only the patient could be too far gone. This wasn't just a medical practice, it was a social performance. The physician, often a university-trained cleric, wasn't a hands-on healer. He diagnosed from a distance by inspecting urine in a special flask, feeling the pulse, and consulting astrology charts. The actual cutting? That was for the barber surgeon, a lower-class tradesman who also cut hair and pulled teeth. Medicine was a hierarchy of theory over practice, where the thinker was revered and the doer was considered a mere mechanic. But alongside this official, learned medicine, there thrived a parallel world of practical care. In villages, the wise woman or cunning folk knew which herbs eased a cough or healed a wound. Midwives delivered babies with experience passed down through generations. Their knowledge was empirical, it worked or it didn't, and it was often more effective than the physician's theories. But because it was unlearned, female, and local, it was dismissed as folk magic and often persecuted as witchcraft. The real engines of practical medical care, ironically, were religious. Monasteries and convents had infirmaries. The monastic rule demanded care for the sick as a form of divine service. Here, treatment was based on prayer, herbal lore from monastery gardens, and the revolutionary idea of rest and cleanliness. While a noble might be bled in his castle, a sick peasant at a monastery might get broth, a clean bed, and someone to pray for him. The latter had a better survival rate. Then came the great disruptor, the Black Death in the 14th century. It shattered the humoral system. Why? Because it killed everyone. The sanguine and the melancholic, the bled and the unbled, those who followed the stars and those who prayed. The theories had no answer. In the terror, doctors fled cities, and the entire learned edifice of medicine was exposed as useless. Out of this chaos came two pivots. First, a desperate, pragmatic turn to public health. Italian city-states invented the quarantina, the 40-day isolation for ships and the sick. They established the first boards of health. This wasn't about balancing humors. It was about brute force separation, an admission that disease might pass from person to person. Second, the plague's devastation created a labor shortage so severe it broke the old feudal order. With workers scarce, their value rose. There was suddenly a societal interest in keeping common people alive and productive. This economic pressure, over the long term, would help shift medicine's focus from the theoretical ailments of the elite to the practical health of the population. The slow march toward the hospital as we know it begins here. Medieval hospitals, like the Hotel Dieu in Paris, weren't primarily for curing the sick. They were religious charities for the poor, the orphaned, the pilgrim, and the dying, places of shelter and spiritual comfort more than medical intervention. But within their walls, the basics of nursing care were standardized. Clean linen, regular meals, separation of the infectious. The real transformation came when these charitable refuges began to merge with the empirical knowledge of surgeons and apothecaries. The battlefield was a brutal but effective teacher. Surgeons treating arrow wounds and sword gashes on crusade or in local wars began to develop practical techniques. How to tie off an artery, how to set a compound fracture. This hands-on, evidence-based knowledge slowly gained respect. So, by the end of the Middle Ages, the medical landscape was a confusing patchwork. You had the ghost of Galen in the university, still muttering about bile. You had the barber surgeon with his hands covered in blood, knowing what actually stopped bleeding. You had the apothecary mixing herbs with increasing sophistication. And you had the monastic infirmary and the civic hospital offering a prototype of institutional care. The body's battlefield was still a slaughterhouse. But the generals were changing. The authority of ancient texts was being quietly undermined by the stubborn, untheorized evidence of experience. The focus was shifting molecule by molecule, from balancing invisible fluids within an individual to managing the visible threats between individuals in a community. It was a messy, halting, and often cruel process. But in this long, dark struggle, the first foundations of modern medicine were being laid, not in a flash of genius, but in the accumulated grit of failed theories, desperate measures, and the hard-won, practical knowledge of those who tended the ill, one broken body at a time. The journey from humors to hospitals was a journey from thinking about the body as a philosophical puzzle to treating it as a physical thing in a world of other physical things. And that shift would change everything. Look around the medieval world and you'll see a glaring contradiction. Life was cheap, fleeting, uncertain. People died from a scratch, a fever, a bad winter. And yet, everywhere, they built things meant to last 1,000 years. Not just functional things, but breathtaking, soaring, impossibly ambitious things. They poured generations of labor and treasure into cathedrals that took longer to build than the average human lifespan. Why? In a world where you might not see next harvest, why commit to a project your great-grandchildren might not see finished? The answer lies in a different relationship with time. For us, time is linear, an arrow shooting from birth to death. For the medieval mind, time was cyclical, seasons, liturgical calendars, and, more importantly, it was eternal. Earthly life was a brief pilgrimage, a blink. True reality was the eternal, unchanging realm of God. Building in stone wasn't for this fleeting age. It was an investment in forever. It was a bridge between the temporary and the eternal. Start with the castle. This seems practical, a fortress for defense. But it's also a statement in limestone. It says, "My family is here and we will remain." Its bulk defies the chaos outside its walls. Building it took years, even decades. The Lord who commissioned it knew he'd likely die before the final tower was capped. But his name, his lineage, would be stamped on the landscape. The castle was a promise of continuity in a world of contested power. Its endurance was its authority. Then the monastery. More than a home for monks, it was a machine for perpetual prayer, an engine to secure salvation across centuries. Its church, scriptorium, and cloisters were built to a timeless plan, often based on the heavenly Jerusalem described in the Bible. The stones were laid to outlast kingdoms, to keep the sacred rhythm of prayers echoing until the end of time itself. A monk copying a manuscript in the 1100s wasn't just preserving text. He was adding a stitch to an eternal tapestry, his anonymous labor part of a project bigger than history. But the ultimate expression of this stone ambition was the Gothic cathedral. Let's be clear about what this was. In an age of hand tools, muscle power, and precarious scaffolding, communities decided to build mountains of glass and stone that reached for the heavens. They were fantastically expensive, dangerously complex, and served no immediate physical need. They were declarations of faith, yes, but also of civic pride, economic power, and profound, collective hope. Imagine being a stonemason on Chartres Cathedral. You start work as a young apprentice. You spend your life high on the walls, carving figures of saints and demons you'll never see from the ground. The nave rises over decades. Your son joins you, then your grandson. You die. The work continues. You are not building a building. You are joining a lineage. Your individual life is a single note in a symphony that plays for 200 years. This long-game mentality required a radical form of trust and communal identity. Taxes were levied for generations. Guilds donated their skills. Farmers hauled stone in off-seasons. Everyone had a stake, not in seeing it finished, but in being part of something that connected them to the past, the saints buried within, and the future, the generations who would worship there. The cathedral was the town's immortal body. Its stone skeleton guaranteeing the community's soul would have a home long after every living member was dust. And it changed them. The technological challenges of building these vaults and flying buttresses pushed the limits of engineering, mathematics, and materials science. The need for vast stained glass created a renaissance in chemistry and artistry. The cathedral school, training clerics, became the nucleus of the first universities. The quest to build for God accidentally trained the minds that would later seek to understand God's creation through science. There's a dark side to this weight, of course. This stone eternity was built on the backs of serfs, paid for with tithes from the poor, and often overseen by an authoritarian church. The glory above was funded by the grind below. The promise of a heavenly future could be used to justify immense earthly suffering. The stones themselves are silent on the cost. But the paradox remains powerful. In the midst of immense personal fragility, they built the least fragile things imaginable. Their answer to the randomness of plague and famine was to create order, geometric, majestic, stone-cold order that laughed at time. When we stand in one of these cathedrals today, we feel that intent. The sheer verticality pulls your eyes and spirit upward, away from the mundane. The colored light from the windows tells sacred stories in a universal language. The space is designed to humble the individual and elevate the communal. It is the physical manifestation of a worldview where the temporary is not all there is. The medieval builder, laying his stone, and the peasant donating a penny, were engaging in an act of profound defiance. They were saying to their unpredictable, cruel, short world, "We are more than this moment. We are part of a story that does not end. And we will make a mark so permanent that even time will have to reckon with it." They built forever not because they were sure of tomorrow, but because they were certain of eternity. And in that certainty, they left a legacy of stone that still, centuries later, has the power to stop our breath and make us feel, for a moment, both terribly small and connected to something terribly large. We've talked about the bones of the medieval world, the stone, the fields, the plagues. But to really understand how people survived inside that world, we have to step into the labyrinth of their minds. Because they lived inside an invisible cage, one built not of stone, but of belief. Its bars were faith, its lock was fear, and its warden was an all-seeing, all-judging God. This psychological landscape wasn't a backdrop to their lives. It was the very air they breathed. Forget the modern idea of religion as a private belief or Sunday routine. In the Middle Ages, faith was the operating system for reality. It explained everything. Why the sun rose, God's will. Why crops failed, God's punishment. Why you got sick, maybe a demon, maybe a test, maybe a punishment. There was no natural cause that wasn't ultimately a divine cause. This wasn't superstition. It was the accepted science of the age. The world was a living, symbolic text written by God, and every event was a word to be interpreted. This created a society drenched in ritual. Life was a constant dialogue with the supernatural. Blessings were sought for crops, animals, houses, tools, holy relics. A saint's finger bone, a splinter of the true cross, were not morbid souvenirs. They were conduits of divine power, brought out to stop plagues or ensure victory. The church bell marked the hours of prayer, structuring the day. The liturgical calendar, Advent, Lent, Easter, structured the year, layering sacred time over agricultural time. This system provided immense comfort. It gave meaning to suffering. A peasant's backbreaking labor wasn't meaningless toil. It was his share of the penance inherited from Adam and Eve, a way to participate in Christ's suffering. Death was not an end, but a perilous journey to a just destination, heaven, hell, or the holding tank of purgatory. In a random, painful world, this belief offered a master narrative where everything mattered. Your smallest action had eternal consequences. But the cage had a sharp, internal hook, fear. Not just fear of hell, though the sermons and church art depicting demons tormenting sinners were graphic enough to cause nightmares, but a more pervasive, daily anxiety. Was God pleased? Were your thoughts pure? Had you committed a mortal sin without knowing it? The concept of sin was expansive. It wasn't just about actions. It was about intentions, desires, fleeting thoughts. This turned the mind itself into a haunted house, where one had to constantly patrol for wayward impulses. This is where the church held immense psychological power. It controlled the keys to the cage. The sacraments. Baptism washed away original sin. Confession and penance cleansed the sins of life. The Eucharist was literally consuming God's grace. Last rites prepared you for the final journey. To be cut off from these sacraments by excommunication wasn't just a social snub. It was a death sentence for the soul, casting you out into eternal darkness. This leverage enforced social order, compelled obedience, and funded the church through payments for indulgences and masses for the dead. Yet, within this rigid cage, people found space to breathe, to negotiate, even to rebel. Folk magic and pagan practices never died. They went underground or fused with Christianity. A prayer to Saint Anthony to find lost things blended with an old charm. A holy well formerly sacred to a Celtic spirit was rededicated to a Christian saint. People maintained a practical, almost contractual relationship with the divine. I'll light this candle, say these prayers, and you, saint, will intercede for my sick child. It was a blend of deep piety and brisk bargaining. And then there were the mystics, people like Hildegard of Bingen or Julian of Norwich, who bypassed the cage's institutional walls entirely. They claimed direct, ecstatic experiences of God. A woman, barred from preaching, could become a vessel for divine visions and have her words written down and revered. Their faith was intensely personal, internal, and often at odds with church authority. They proved that even the most formidable cage could not entirely contain the human spirit's yearning for direct connection. The real psychological burden fell on those who genuinely wrestled with doubt. To doubt in an age of absolute certainty was a terrifying, lonely torment. There was no secular space, no alternative worldview to retreat to. A doubter wasn't an intellectual. They were a soul in mortal danger, likely under demonic influence. Their struggle was silent, internal, and could tip into what we'd now call madness or despair. So, how did they survive inside this cage? By accepting its walls as the shape of reality itself, and then learning to live fully within them. Their faith was not a passive belief, but an active, daily practice of meaning-making. It turned chaos into narrative, suffering into purpose, and a short, brutal life into a prelude to eternity. The fear was the price of admission for the comfort. When the medieval world finally began to crack, with the Black Death shaking belief in a just God, with the rise of humanism emphasizing earthly life, it wasn't just institutions that changed. It was the human psyche. The invisible cage began to rust. The world slowly stopped being a divine drama and started becoming a physical system to be studied and mastered. The long, slow journey to the modern mind, a mind that fears climate change more than hellfire, that seeks therapy for guilt rather than absolution, began when people started to believe that the bars around them might not be eternal, but man-made. But for 1,000 years, the cage was home, and within its confines, people loved, created, feared, hoped, and built their cathedrals. Not in spite of their constrained reality, but because of it. They forged a psychology of endurance by believing their endurance had a divine witness and an eternal reward. In a world of visible hardship, it was their invisible architecture of belief that often determined whether they broke or merely bent. Castles and cathedrals give us the illusion that the medieval world was static, isolated, a collection of lonely villages under the shadow of a local lord's keep. But scratch the surface and you find a world humming with movement, connection, and surprisingly long-distance relationships. The real skeleton of medieval Europe wasn't just its stone fortresses. It was a sprawling, fragile, but resilient network of trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and wandering minds. Let's start with the most tangible thread: trade. After the collapse of Rome, long-distance commerce didn't vanish. It shrank, localized, and then slowly, stubbornly reknit itself. By the High Middle Ages, a vast circulatory system was pumping goods across the continent and beyond. Wool from England flowed to the weavers of Flanders. Furs from Russia and the Baltic reached Paris and London. Spices from India and the Moluccas, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, traveled along the Silk Road, through Arab traders, into the markets of Venice and Genoa, ending up flavoring the feasts of kings and the stewpots of wealthy burghers. This wasn't just about luxury. Salt, necessary for preserving food, was mined in places like Salzburg, Salt Castle, and traded inland. Iron for tools and weapons came from specific regions. The network moved necessities as well as novelties. To facilitate this, great trade fairs sprang up like the one in Champagne, France. For weeks each year, it became a temporary international city where Flemish cloth met Italian silks and Eastern spices, all brokered with a babble of languages and complex credit systems using letters of exchange, an early form of the check. And where goods went, people followed. Not just merchants, but specialists. Master masons from Flanders hired to build a cathedral in Sweden, German miners brought to Cornwall to improve tin extraction, Italian bankers setting up counting houses in London. Knowledge was a commodity too, carried on the boots of these travelers. Then there were the pilgrims. In an age where faith was the GPS for the soul, pilgrimage was a mass movement. People from all walks of life, peasants granted leave by their lord, nobles doing penance, the sick desperate for a cure, took to the roads. They headed to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, to Canterbury in England. The journey itself was the point, a physical ordeal that mirrored spiritual purification. These pilgrimage routes became the first tourist infrastructures. Monasteries and hostels sprouted along the way to house travelers. Roads, while terrible, were maintained for this traffic. A pilgrim from Germany might spend months traveling through France, sharing stories, news, and germs with people he'd never otherwise meet. The pilgrimage network created a shared European identity, a common map of the sacred, and a surprising amount of cultural cross-pollination. Songs, stories, and architectural ideas hitched a ride with the faithful. And we cannot forget the scholars. The Republic of Letters began in the Middle Ages. A student from Poland could travel to the University of Bologna to study law, to Paris for theology, to Salerno for medicine. Latin was the common tongue of this intellectual network. Books, painstakingly copied, traveled from library to library. Ideas about Aristotle, filtered through Arab commentators in places like Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, sparked intellectual revolutions in Christian universities. This web of learning was fragile, often contested by authorities, but it was persistent. It meant that a new thought in Oxford could, within a generation, be debated in Prague. This network had a dark underside, of course. Carried more than silk and ideas. Carried disease. The Black Death was the most horrific passenger, racing along the trade routes from the Black Sea ports to Sicily and then up through Europe with terrifying speed. The very connections that enriched life also delivered the apocalypse. The network giveth and the network taketh away. It also carried conflict. The routes were tempting targets for bandits. Rival cities like Venice and Genoa fought naval wars over control of trade. The Crusades themselves were a violent, catastrophic perversion of the pilgrimage impulse, attempting to force open a sacred trade route to Jerusalem with sheer brutality. But the existence of the network is what makes the medieval world dynamic, not static. It reminds us that the peasant in his field might wear a buckle made from German brass, pay his rent in silver coin minted from Bohemian ore, and hear a sermon from a priest who'd studied in a distant city quoting a theologian from another country. He was locally rooted but globally connected in ways he barely understood. This network of goods, feet, and minds was the true antidote to the era's fragmentation. It was a nervous system slowly waking up, transmitting pulses of commerce, faith, and knowledge across a battered body. It created a sense of a world larger than the manor, a Christendom that was more than just a word in a prayer. It laid the logistical and mental groundwork for the age of exploration to come. Before ships could sail over the horizon, people had to believe there was something over the horizon worth connecting to. The medieval network taught them that. It taught them that survival wasn't just about hunkering down behind your own walls. It was also about being part of the flow, however risky that flow might be. We've mapped the grand structures, the kingdoms, the churches, the trade routes. We've talked about survival in terms of bread, medicine, and faith. But what about the heart? Did medieval people fall in love? Did they grieve? Did they laugh at stupid jokes behind the barn? How did the human spirit, with all its tender, messy needs, find space to live inside the iron framework of duty, doctrine, and daily peril? The short answer is fiercely, carefully, and in ways that would feel both alien and intimately familiar to us. The medieval heart was not a free agent. It was bound by contracts, shaped by religion, and hemmed in by the brutal economics of survival. And yet, within those confines, it found its ways. Let's start with the most regulated space: marriage. For the nobility, marriage was a geopolitical event. A treaty sealed with a bride. A disputed territory settled with a wedding. Love had nothing to do with it. A lord's daughter was a piece on the chessboard of dynasty. Her feelings were irrelevant. Her duty was to produce heirs and cement an alliance. We have records of noblewomen married as children, sent to live in foreign courts, their entire lives a negotiation between their birth family and their husbands. For peasants, marriage was an economic partnership. You married someone from your village or the next one over, someone whose family you knew, whose land or skills complemented yours. Romance might grow or it might not. The goal was a functional unit. 2 workers to run a farmstead, raise children to be more workers, and provide mutual support in old age. Love was a hoped-for bonus, not the foundation. But this doesn't mean the heart was silent. The concept of courtly love, born in the 12th century, is fascinating proof. This was a highly stylized, literary fantasy where a knight professed passionate, devoted, and almost always chaste love for a high-born lady, usually another man's wife. He would perform deeds in her name, write poetry of his suffering, and adore her from an unreachable distance. It was a game for the aristocracy, a safe way to explore intense emotion outside the cold realities of arranged marriage. It created a space where longing and idealized beauty could be celebrated, even as real-life unions were about power and property. It was love as a leisure activity for the privileged. For ordinary people, evidence of affection is quieter but persistent. We'll show husbands leaving their best pan or a specific cow to a beloved wife. Tombstones of couples show them holding hands. Folk songs are full of stolen kisses, tragic partings, and longing. The church, trying to regulate even this, promoted the ideal of marital affection. A calm, companionable love based on mutual respect and shared faith. It wasn't fireworks, but it was a sanctioned space for tenderness. Then there's grief. This is where the medieval heart speaks in a voice we can't mistake. The sheer frequency of death did not inure people to its sting. It just changed the shape of mourning. The loss of a child was a common, yet always devastating tragedy. We see it in personal writings, in the proliferation of prayers to Saint Margaret, patroness of childbirth. Parents commissioned small memorials, had masses said for their child's soul for years. The intensity of their prayer was a measure of their love. The elaborate rituals around death, the wake, the funeral procession, the perpetual chantry masses funded by the wealthy, were not just about the soul's journey. They were a container for the living's grief, a socially approved way to fall apart and then be slowly reintegrated into the community. To mourn too long or too flamboyantly was suspect. To not mourn at all was inhuman. There was a script, and following it was a way to survive the loss. Friendship, too, was a vital lifeline. In monasteries, the concept of spiritual friendship was deeply valued, a bond between monks based on shared faith and mutual encouragement in a difficult life. In villages, the good neighbor was essential. You helped with their harvest, they helped roof your house. You stood godparent to their child, creating a fictive kinship bond, compadrazgo, that was as strong as blood. These relationships were the social safety net, the daily affirmation that you were not alone in the struggle. And what of private joy? The spaces for it were small but precious. A family sharing a storytelling by the hearth after a long day. The illicit thrill of a carnival or fair, where social rules relaxed. The simple pleasure of a well-cooked meal on a feast day, of music from a traveling minstrel, of seeing your children healthy and strong through another winter. Laughter was survival, too. Medieval manuscripts are filled with marginalia, doodles in the borders of serious texts, of monkeys, grotesque faces, and bawdy scenes. The scribes, bored or rebellious, inserted their humanity into the sacred. Humor was the pressure valve for a world under immense spiritual and physical pressure. The private medieval life was, in many ways, a series of negotiations between the heart's desires and the world's demands. Love was often bent to the service of duty. Grief was channeled through ritual. Joy was snatched in the interstices of toil. But to think they did not feel these things deeply is to misunderstand them completely. Their emotional world was not less rich than ours. It was differently structured. Intensity was not diluted by frequency. If anything, the constant presence of loss made attachment more poignant, and moments of safety and affection more precious. They loved, not with the assumption of forever, but with the keen awareness that tomorrow was not promised. They grieved not with the shock of the unprecedented, but with the weary familiarity of an old, relentless foe. They built their private lives in the shadow of the cathedral and the castle, finding corners of warmth, loyalty, and even raucous laughter in a world that could be very dark and very cold. The heart, in the end, was their most personal fortress. And within its walls, they guarded the fragile, essential flame of human connection, the one thing that made all the surviving worth the struggle. We've walked a long road, from the precarious cradle of medieval childhood to the silent citadels of the Stoic mind, from the sun-baked diplomacy of an Egyptian queen to the frozen sanctuary of a Siberian shaman. We've seen endurance carved in stone, in ink, and in the quiet rhythm of a daily prayer. Now, at the end, we have to ask, why does any of this matter to us, here, now, in a world they couldn't have dreamed of? Because their survival is not just a historical fact. It's our inheritance. It's the bedrock under our feet, whether we feel it or not. We are the children of the survivors. Every choice we take for granted, to see a doctor, to expect a lifespan beyond 40, to believe our individual feelings matter, was paid for with their uncertainty, their resilience, and their often terrible cost. Think about it. The medieval peasant, rising before dawn to work a field that might not feed his family, was building the agricultural surplus that would eventually fund cities, universities, and leisure. His exhaustion is in the DNA of our economy. The monk, copying a crumbling text by flickering candlelight, was a single, fragile link in a chain that passed Aristotle and Plato down to the thinkers of the Enlightenment. His eye strain is in the foundation of our philosophy. Nefertari, using her literacy and grace to broker peace instead of war, demonstrated that statecraft could be as much about intelligence and relationship as brute force. Her silenced voice whispers in the ear of every modern diplomat. The Ice Maiden, her body a testament to a culture that saw power in spiritual knowledge rather than in armies, forces us to expand our definition of strength and to question who has the right to tell the story of the past. Her silent gaze is a challenge to our intellectual arrogance. And the Stoics? They handed us the ultimate tool for the modern condition, the owner's manual for the mind in a chaotic universe. In an age of digital overwhelm, of curated lives and crushing comparison, their simple, brutal question, is this within my control? Is a lifeline. Their philosophy is the ancient, open-source code for mental resilience that we keep rediscovering because we desperately need it. We look back at the life expectancy of 30 and feel a smug distance. But we miss the point. Their world wasn't about dying young. It was about living with an intensity forged in the fire of constant risk. They didn't have the luxury of assuming a long, linear future. So they invested in depth, in legacy, in the moment. They cherished what they had because they knew, bone deep, that it could vanish. That's not a primitive mindset. It's a tragically clear-eyed one. Our modern world is, in many ways, a magnificent monument to solving their problems. We have conquered the infections that killed their children. We have food security they would have seen as miraculous. We have unlocked freedoms of thought, movement, and identity they could scarcely conceive. But in solving their external problems, we may have created new internal ones. We traded the fear of plague for the anxiety of the unknown future. We traded the certainty of a divine plan for the vertigo of making our own meaning. We traded the close-knit, suffocating community for the often isolating freedom of the individual. We are safer, but are we steadier? That's why we need their stories. Not as a quaint look at a brutal past, but as a mirror. They teach us that endurance is not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. That legacy is built not only in grand gestures, but in the daily, stubborn choice to continue. That a life can be short, or hard, or confined, and yet be charged with dignity, love, and purpose. We stand on the other side of a great divide. We have light, heat, and answers to questions that haunted them. But we still share the same human heart, one that fears loss, seeks love, and craves meaning. Their survival is the proof that this heart can beat through darkness. It's the echo that reaches us, a reminder written in stone, ice, and parchment. We persisted. We felt. We built. We remembered. The final lesson of their survival is not about them. It's about the capacity of the human spirit itself. In the face of randomness, suffering, and the sheer indifference of the universe, people have always done more than just endure. They have forged meaning. They have connected. They have created beauty. They have passed the fire. Your life, with all its modern complexities and privileges, is part of that same unbroken chain. You are not separate from the woman choosing herbs for a sick child, the man carving a stone for a cathedral he'll never see finished, or the philosopher choosing his response to fate. You are the current chapter in a very long story of stubborn, brilliant, fragile, and relentless survival. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by the chaos of your own moment, remember the weight of stone, the silence of the ice, the clarity of the porch. You come from people who looked at a world far more dangerous and uncertain than ours, and they not only survived it. They sang in it, they prayed in it, they questioned it, and they built bridges from their time to ours. The echo of their endurance is the ground we walk on. And the future is just the next part of the story we're all still writing, together.